work with Women Helping Women. It just told me my connection was bad. Can you guys hear me okay? I see some nods. I think so. Okay. Yeah. So when I before my doctoral work, while I was in my master's program, I was working at a rape crisis and abuse center, Women Helping Women. And that was really what sparked a lot of my theological questions, especially after serving on the hotline and as a support group manager for several years and hearing questions like, why did God let this happen to me? In order to be a good Christian, I need to stay in this relationship. And this is all part of my call to live into my faith. And the kind of ways in which gender and theology and faith get all tied up in really messy ways that need to be kind of split apart and questioned. And so that's kind of what drove me into the areas of trauma and especially feminist theology. So thinking about how gender shapes our theological questions, how our kind of history, the long history that church has with gender and with sexual orientation and with race, how those things kind of overlay and contextualize our theology. So that's what I kind of propose to introduce to you all. And I'm sure many of you have read a lot of pieces from these different pockets, right? From feminist theologians or womanist theologians or people that write on trauma. So what I kind of wanted to start off was talking about like how these different branches of theology or these different umbrellas of theology get talked about as a whole, right? So what we're talking about today, and I think you guys, the next time we all meet, we'll continue to talk about this kind of contextual theology, which is the understanding that our context affects theological thinking and practice. So it's that our culture, our historical context, our philosophical worldviews, and our identity, how we live out our race and gender and sexual orientation and other things, affect how we practice, how we think about religion, how we think about God, how we think about sin and suffering. And this was really a kind of a turn for the Catholic Church in kind of the post-Vatican II timeframe. And I think both Bill and Martin talked a lot about that, kind of this switch that happened where the church started to really dig into thinking about how history has shaped its legacy and its theology and the tradition as a whole, kind of the capital T tradition. So one of the big things that contextual theologies do is to question our assumed norms. So often in theology, we are building ethical norms and religious norms around assumed shared values, things like a shared value towards nonviolence or towards flourishing of humanity, or the norms of the nuclear family, or in the United States, we've got particular norms around individualism and being able to the kind of Protestant work ethic that really shapes our culture. And contextual theology doesn't take those for granted. It wants to look at those more carefully and perhaps re-embrace them, but after they are deconstructed in some way and questioned, to make sure that we're not just kind of taking a lot of this cultural piece wholesale. So feminist theology and womanist theology are what I'm going to be talking about today, specifically as a kind of subsection of contextual theologies. And the womanist, I'll explain a little bit about the language, the difference between feminist and womanist theology. So to start though, feminist theology is a theological conversation kind of rooted in the feminist social movement. So feminism as a larger social movement, especially, when I have this conversation with my 18-year-old undergrads, I kind of asked them initially, what are your thoughts when you think of feminism, right? When you hear that word feminist, what comes to mind? What are the good, the bad, the ugly? And we have that kind of conversation. And when it comes down to it, the feminist social movement, and especially feminist theology, goes off of the idea that women's rights are based on the equality of sexes, that this isn't women over men, but rather that both men and women are equal. And feminist theory is a critical stance that challenges the patriarchal gender paradigm. So that the kind of tradition, starting really with the Roman household, with the patriarch. And we've kind of inherited this idea that the men of the household are in the public sphere, and women are to be in the private sphere and are inferior to the male of the house. And so we've inherited this, and feminist theory questions that norm. And this norm is something that associates males with human characteristics defined as superior or dominant, things like rational and powerful, and then females, on the other hand, are defined as inferior or auxiliary, intuitional, passive. And this is a definition taken out of Rosemary Radford Ruther's work, who's kind of one of the initial pioneering feminist theologians. And then feminist theology itself kind of springboards off of feminist theory to take that feminist critique of the patriarchal household and how our structures reinforce gender difference, and look at that and use it to reconstruct theological claims. So to look at things like the language around God as Father, and how that has predominantly been our main way of talking and thinking about God in the Western Church. Looking at things like the role of gender in Jesus on the cross. The very early essay written by Rosemary herself was talking about, can a male savior save women, right? Is the gender of Jesus significant in that way, or is it more a tool of the context of the time? So there was kind of branching off those particular questions. And if I go too fast, or if questions pop up, please feel free to use the little raise hand button or throw something in the chat. I've become relatively good. As I say that, I'm sure I'll miss something, but with my students, they can raise hands and things. So I'm going to admit that person. Okay. So one of the things I like to cover when just giving a real quick overview of feminist theology is, again, that this isn't just about gender. It's not men versus women, but rather about the whole structure that our society has built around. And I think Elizabeth Schusser-Fiorenza's phrase of kyriarchy is really helpful. Real quick, I got to say goodnight to my toddler. Come here. Oh, you say goodnight and say hi.
Hi.
Okay. I love you.
I forgot to say hi.
Oh, you got to say hi. Okay.
Hi.
Okay. All right. Oh. Can you come grab her? Oh, sorry. Go to daddy. Go to daddy. I know. It's okay. Sorry. I was going to mute that, but I couldn't figure out where the mute button went. There we go. Back on to sharing. We've been, oh, there she goes crying down the stairs. I'm sorry. All right. Contextual theology. Here we go. And my context is one of living in quarantine with a toddler that I love. All right, so kyriarchy is a really great phrase because it's not just patriarchy, right? The leading of the male, but also the leading of the Lord. So here is kind of a pyramid to show you that it's talking about not just gender, but also class. So those who are freeborn, propertied, educated, male, and head of household, kind of are seen as the full citizen. So you've got the Lord at the top, and then his lady is underneath, but still very high in the kyriarchical structure because of her status as being propertied and freeborn and educated. The adult sons, freeborn unmarried women, and here Schusser-Fiorenza is using the term woe/men. So if you see that term, she's talking about humans, specifically non-patriarchal persons, right? So the man is the Lord, and then everybody else kind of goes into this woman category. We get freeborn working women and men, freed women and men, settlers and immigrants. So you're getting even further down because of kind of the status as the other. Slave men, slave women and concubines, barbarians, and then animals, wilderness, and the uncivilized world. So even in the ecological framing kind of becomes the very bottom. And the more someone is othered in a society, the lower they are on that structure. So I go over this just to kind of bring everyone in aware that feminist theory and feminist theology is not, again, just about that gender question, but also how our race and class and education all play a role in how essentially human we are seen by our context. And then I wanted to give a brief overview of feminist theology, just kind of a historical piece here. So what feminist theology can be kind of rooted in kind of this proto-feminist first wave, which really you see women and men writing about women and men's issues, about gender issues, all the way kind of throughout the church's history. And most significantly, you see this kind of burgeoning of proto-feminists in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance with folks like Julian of Norwich and Hildegard of Bingen and other female mystics who really took their embodied experience as women into their conversations with God and into their theological understanding. So Julian of Norwich kind of famously talks about God as the breastfeeding mother and Jesus as kind of feeding us from his wound. And so uses this very feminine language to talk about the divine. Hildegard of Bingen does a ton of writing around kind of very similar gender issues, but then she also really broke a lot of gender norms by becoming a leader in her convent and becoming kind of this really kind of heavy-hitting scholar, which was very unusual for women at the time who were not were not educated in the same way that men were able to be. And so this kind of carries us up through very early 1900s, where we get the suffragists and the abolitionist movements with folks like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Sojourner Truth, who are fighting for freedom based around race and freedom based around gender. And kind of bringing in their theology and their religion in ways that were new and pushed against the way the church had functioned before. It's not until the 1960s that you get women and into the theological schools. So folks like Rosemary Radford Ruther and Mary Daly and Elizabeth Schuster Fiorenza are kind of the first pioneering women, or the first generation of women in theological schools who learn and do theology at that kind of university level. And that this is really the historical context, again, is that civil rights and anti-war movements and Vatican II for Catholic women. So we are, lay women and sisters and nuns are allowed to then kind of seek this particular vocation. And so you get this kind of first generation of quote unquote feminist theologians who then kind of are the professors of the next generation of this third wave feminist movement, which is, women are teaching in the academy, they're mentoring other women. There is a renewed sense of globalization that's happening in this context. The continued work of civil rights all kind of create this context where we get a much more intersectional idea of what feminist theology is. So prior to the third wave, feminist theology is mostly being written by white women. And the kind of next gen of folks like Jacqueline Grant and Dolores Williams, who are womanist theologians, come in and say, you're describing white women's experience, which is not the exact same as my experience as a Black woman. And they were also looking at their Black theologians and saying, you're describing Black male experiences and not the same as my Black woman's experience. And so you get kind of each context coming back to the conversation saying, but I want to push back on this, or I want to add to this in this way. And so you get intersections like womanist theology, which focuses on race and Black theology specifically, Mujerista or Latina or Hispanic theologies, which focus again on race and gender, but also around class and the roles of immigration. Asian feminists like Kwok Pui-lan, post-colonial feminists also like Kwok Pui-lan, or other folks who are kind of looking at the norm of the westernized church and saying, here in my particular context of the African church or of the Indian church or the Latin American church looks different because we're not of that Western culture. Then there's also the conversation around interreligious dialogue and queer theology and ecofeminism, again, kind of all pick up on these particular contexts. So let's see what time we got. Make sure we've got enough time for the film. I want to talk a little bit about some of the research that went into this. So we're going to watch Forging Voice. which is a film that I did with a colleague of mine, Kate Common. And what we did was Kate, it was actually we were at a conference together. We were both grad students at the time. And she had just heard about Mary Daly's death. And so Mary Daly was this, huge feminist theologian, wrote Beyond God the Father. And she had actually broken with the Catholic Church because of her really staunch patriarchal, magisterium view of the church, and ended up breaking with it in a way that, folks like Elizabeth Johnson or Elizabeth Justifienza or Rosemary Radford Ruther didn't. And so we had just heard that she had passed away. And my friend Kate was like, I would have loved to interview her, to just hear about what it was like to be that kind of first batch of women into school, and like what they had to face and deal with. And so she really started playing with this idea that we could start to have these interviews and talk to these women and talk to them more about just their writing, but also about their life experiences that led them to to kind of form the questions that they did. So we worked with the Women's Caucus of the American Academy of Religions, and they were able to connect us, kind of being that, oh, these girls are legit. You can, have them come and interview you. They were kind of a really good bridging partner there. And they connected us with, 11, we're still building. So it's one of those things that as we get folks who want to come forward and do interviews, we add to that. But currently we have 11 of these kind of first gen, and some of the third, second generation, especially when you think about kind of like womanist or mujerista theologians. So it's that kind of first and second wave. And most of the questions are, again, were around questions of how they experienced gender early in life, how they experienced their race, their sexual orientation, and how they found their voice. And so that's really the focus of the piece, is that forging voice question of how they were able to bring their own voice into theology in a way that spoke, their truth and listened back from the tradition and from different scripture and sources. So we'll watch this, and then we will break into small groups to have some conversation and reflection on the piece. Are there any questions before we jump into the film? If you've put anything in the chat, I can see that too. All right. I will switch screens. And we had, you'll see in the credits, so myself and Kate, and then we also commissioned the music from Elizabeth Ersick, who's another feminist theologian, and she does music and religion, and so she was able to create these kind of 3 kind of mini pieces that you'll hear throughout. So that's kind of an added bonus of getting some really cool music pieces created for this too. All right.
Brooklyn, near the Narrows, which is the entrance to New York Harbor, and all of the ships would come in from around the world, and little tugboats would pull them into their berths. And I loved watching those little tugboats. And so one of the first things I ever wanted to be when I grew up was a tugboat driver, okay? And I was told girls can't do that, And then when I was able to go to the airport, my dad was a safety inspector for American Airlines. I wanted to be an airline pilot. And I was told girls can't do that. So there's all these interesting things that girls couldn't do. I suppose that's one of my first memories of gender.
In second grade, teacher had us write a famous essay for children. If you had 3 wishes. Since I grew up right after the war, I said I hoped that there would be no war, my first wish. My second was that I would get a lot of chocolate. And my third was that one day I would be Pope. And I always say, you see what happens to girls, because that was in second grade. One day I wanted to be Pope. And when I was 15, 16, I just wanted to be pastoral assistant. So reality was setting in.
Probably no older than 8 years old. So somewhere in those early years, my mother would sit me down in front of the television every night to braid my hair for the next day for school and put on the dreaded stocking cap to hold everything in place. And we would watch WRAL TV out of Raleigh. And it was at that point that Jesse Helms was a media executive and would do nightly commentaries on the station. And he would be talking about the Negras and the Northern agitators and a lot of the joys of segregation and protecting people, whatnot. And Mom never said a word. She just let me sit and listen. And she knew sooner or later my curiosity would get the better of me. And I finally asked her one night, who is he talking about? Because I had figured out Negras was a way of him saying Negroes. And I didn't know anybody like the people he was describing. So I was a little puzzled by it. And she just explained, don't let anybody define you when you know something different about yourself. The people you know are good people. And he's got his opinions, but you've got to live your life like you're a child of God. And that seemed like a good enough explanation for me. But it was the first time I got a real strong sense that people out there who hate me or drew conclusions about me just based on the color of my skin.
I played golf from a very early age. I was very good from a very early age. And it really amazed me that there were parts of the golf club I couldn't go into. There were days of the week that I couldn't play. That men seemed to think that women shouldn't have been there anyway. So actually, it wasn't a sort of theological first impression. It was actually from sort of life itself. And it's amusing when I look back now, but I played on the university golf team in the UK, which is not the same setup as you have in America. And I was the captain of the team, and I couldn't play because I was a woman. So I was the one that drove them around and made the tee and couldn't play. And yet I was by far the better golfer as well. So all of that started making me think that there are issues, obviously, with gender, or as it was perceived. And then, of course, once I started to study theology, it was absolutely obvious to me that they're huge problems and that being a woman in theology is a very difficult task, really. Yeah.
And my parents went to Hong Kong after the Second World War, and they were traditional parents. And so my parents gave birth to 5 girls before the 2 sons finally arrived. And for anyone from an Asian background will understand perfectly that they have waited for the 2 sons to come to continue the family line. And so that means if you are born a girl, and then you had that kind of internalized oppression sometimes that you are less than, or you receive less than the sons in the family. So I think that from early childhood, I began to question why girls were treated that way. And that is why when people said that I learned feminism when I came abroad to study, I just laugh. How could it be? Because people did not understand. Each person had a particular story.
I married, were having kids, but was continuing to finish my MA and PhD. And all of that seemed very natural until I actually finished my PhD. And I brought my doctoral thesis to this professor, hand in. And I had my third child on my hip. So I handed his money, and he said, sort of in a grumpy way, "I'm very disappointed. You're going to go off and teach someplace else, and I expected you to be my TA. I don't know whether you said for the rest of your life, but that was kind of the implication. I remember thinking, what? Did you really think I got a PhD to keep on being your TA for the rest of my life?" So I just said nothing because I knew I needed his vote to pass. In other words, I was going to have the oral shortly thereafter. But that really, deeply shocked and disappointed me. That, well, sorry, I'm leaving. And I have a job on the other side of the country.
One night when I was about, 10 or 11, it occurred to me as I was falling asleep one night that God might be a woman. And I remember lying there in total jubilation, thinking, we don't know who God is. There's no reason that God couldn't be a woman. And then I forgot about that experience for years until really I was a graduate student and began thinking about female God language.
I was writing my dissertation on Elie Wiesel, on the Holocaust, and I was drawn to Elie Wiesel because he was arguing with God, like, how could you have done this to us? And we were your people, we loved you, how could you have done this to us? And this was the question I began my dissertation with. But one night when I was working on that question, I lay down on the bed. I was working late at night, drinking lots of Diet Cola, smoking, and with my electric typewriter. And I lay down on the bed and I started saying to God, how could you have done this to women? Why didn't you send us a prophet? Why did you let those words get written in the Bible that said we were second? Why did you let women be raped? Why didn't you intervene when they were being raped? Why didn't you stop this and that? I was all in my head. I wasn't speaking aloud. And then I just sort of, when I finished, I just sort of lay there and I heard a kind of a voice in my mind, and it said, in God, there's a woman like yourself. She too has suffered and lost her history. And that was the first time that I ever really thought of a female God. And I've been searching for her ever since.
I left here, ITC, and I went to New York and to pursue my doctoral work in theology. And I was going there to study with Dr. James Cone. One of the things Dr. Cone said to me, he took me to lunch and we were talking about what to expect when I get to Union in the fall. And one of the things he said to me, we don't need another James Cone. I said, okay. Well, he said it again, we don't need another James Cone. What he was saying to me is, my voice is not your voice. You're coming to Union Theological Seminary. Yes, you're going to study with me, but what we're going to need from you is your voice. Very, very liberating. He was not looking for disciples. He was looking for scholars to be able to speak and to speak out of our own context, the context that historically had been violated by ideologies of white supremacy, a context that's been violated by patriarchy, a context that was violated by classism and a lot of other isms that we have been negatively impacted by over the years, over the decades, over the centuries of our presence in these United States.
San Luis Sonora, there was a group of religious women, nuns. And for me, they were so educated. And they had no hospitals, no schools. They were missionaries, working always with the poor. That was the charism of this community. The Helper Sisters, this French community. And they were coming from the best traditions of religious education at the Catholic Institute in Paris. So for me, they became my idols, my icons. Oh, how much I wish to be an educated woman and then teaching religion. And so my desire of learning was enriched by my contact with the sisters. So every Saturday for me, it was a matter of being at the church, learning about lessons. I also learned about guitar. I forgot about that, right now, but it's just so it was forming a community of young women concerned about religious education and learning about the best methods for conveying, quote unquote, the truths of Christianity to the people. So that environment made me grow in self-esteem, in desire for doing something that also gave me direction in life. So by my age of 17, I joined the community. I went to Mexico City, and that is how I continued to develop. But from being a catechist at early age, soon as I became part of the community, my idea was I needed to study theology. And the sisters were very supportive at that point. In my BA in licensing in theology, I completed my studies while being a part of the sisters. The issue with the community came when I wanted to continue with my doctoral studies. They said that I was too young. I was 26, 27 years old. Too young. I should wait for 10 more years so that I can go to my doctoral studies. So to me, at that age, it was like the time for waiting was long. So that is why I left the community. It was not because lack of vocation, which I do love and I admire the sisters so very much. I have a great deal of respect for the nuns in general, but in particular for those nuns whose charism is that mission, is that being out there with the people, is that dedicating their lives to the promotion of justice among the poor.
I've always felt as a white woman from a upper middle class family with great access to education and resources that part of my responsibility has been to create new spaces where other people could have that and to create new ways of doing the work. And so when I came back from Argentina with a real, now sort of beginning to get serious about something here, I really didn't find any kind of work that I really wanted. I didn't, as I always say, I didn't want to teach Our Lady of the Snowdrop, Intro to Feminist Theology 101 for, a bunch of semesters until I would retire. I really wanted to do something much more dynamic. And some of the women from Network, the nuns on the bus, some of the women from Network said, well, why don't you start something that would be like Network, except for women in religion? And that was really the inspiration for what I called the Women's Alliance for Theology. And I had 2 pieces of paper. I wrote a little proposal on a typewriter. I people won't even remember what that is, but on a typewriter with whiteout, I wrote a little proposal, which we do have at the Water Office, actually, the original founding document. Then I started peddling it to women, especially in the Protestant church bureaucracies and Catholic nuns. And the Sisters of Loretto gave us our first grant. And then we opened an office, and we decided, we had a meeting one time with a group of women, the founding group, which was about a dozen women. And I was talking to them about this idea I had, and people like Elizabeth Schuster Fiorenza and Mary Collins and Madonna Kolbenschlag, and of course Diane and I were there, and others. And they said, well, Women's Alliance for Theology, that's a great idea. And so they said, why don't you both do it? Because my partner Diane had also trained at the Jesuit School of Theology in Berkeley. We had both done the Master of Divinity there. She later did a master's in sacred theology and a master's in social work and a doctorate in ministry. So we were literally all dressed up with no place to go as out lesbians who were pro-choice. There was not a huge market for us in Catholic circles in those days, but there was a need, and especially a need for Catholic women, but for others as well. And so the Network People's idea gave me the idea, was a good one. And the encouragement of people like Elizabeth and Mary Collins was helpful, but it wasn't really very practical because we like to eat as well. So how would we make a living doing this? But somehow we managed, and Diane did the liturgy and ritual part. And I woke up one morning and I said to her, wait, Women's Alliance for Theology, that's really kind of flat. What if we added ethics and ritual? We could call it water, sort of ha-ha. And it has been the ha-ha ever since, that the name turned out to be really inspired in the sense that it allows a lot of different possibilities, both symbolic and strategic.
After I became a faculty member, I was now the first woman and the only woman again on this faculty at Catholic University. I knew that the standard for tenure was very high. There are a lot of great publishing scholars there. And it was particularly fraught because of my gender when it came up time for tenure. So I did receive the vote of the faculty for tenure, but my case was held up by the Archbishop. This is a pontifical university, because of an essay I had written on feminist theology. And so the Vatican got involved. I had to answer a whole series of questions, first in writing, then in person, and so on. So by the time I got tenure, it was well into the year of grace. I really felt I was finished, as a research scholar there. But in the end, I did get tenure. And the experience of that, I think, more than anything, awakened me to the power of patriarchy in the church and the threat that anyone is who makes, or was at that time, who makes a statement that somehow challenges or goes up against or shows even a different way of thinking than the standard, male-oriented pattern. My project was a simple book speaking about female images of God. So when I started to write it, the anger in me against patriarchy came out in such venom. It almost frightened me. I was so angry. And I thought, well, this isn't going to get anybody anywhere. It's like when you're angry in the classroom and you yell at the student, automatically as a teacher, you have lost. You know what I mean? So I said, well, no, find another approach and so on. But what I did that whole year, and really it was the energy of the tenure battle and my anger as a result of it all, was I wrote She Who Is. That's how that came out. So when I would be petering out of energy, I would remember some of the things that happened. I go, whoop, back to the computer, another chapter. No, but it went on like that. It fueled my energy to do theology in the way that hopefully would make a difference, that I could use arguments from scripture and tradition and women's experience today and lay something out that wasn't crazy, wasn't like, oh, they just could be dismissed, but had to be taken seriously within. If you take these sources seriously, then you need to look at this. And I think ever since, that's been the method that has come to me to do theology, is with that in mind. That has never gone away. Yeah.
Calculus had also, when I was on sabbatical at Union, called the New York Scholars, Feminist Scholars of New York, something like this. And there was the whole room full of high-powered on Beverly Harrison. Mary Daly was not there, but all of the people who became leading feminists afterwards. And I, because my English was so weak, I mean, I was very conscious of my English. I always thought when I had faculty meetings or so, when I said something, nobody would pick it up. And then the conversation would move a while. And then a colleague would say something very similar, if not the same. And then it was suddenly a brilliant idea, you see. So I always thought the problem was my English, and they didn't quite understand it. And I never forget, we were in a living room of, I don't remember of whom, at Union Theological Seminary, and there was this group of high-powered American women, and one after the other shared the same kind of experience. So I was cured to claim my accent or not being understood. So, yeah.
Another scholar that was very influential in my own intellectual formation was Professor Letty Russell of Yale Divinity School. I met her in 1983. She was the first feminist theologian from the West that I met. And so she was invited to South Korea to deliver a couple of lectures. And so I went there and in one occasion as her respondent. And so that is how we met. And then I came over in 1984 to begin my doctoral studies. And Letty Russell and Shannon Clarkson invited us to her house and then to form a little fellowship for Asian and Asian American women. 13 of us in her living room started this network that is now called Pacific Asian and North American Asian Women in Theology and Ministry. When we started 32 years ago, we would not have imagined it will continue until the present day. And so then when I became a faculty, and then I served as a faculty advisor. So those who finished, like written a consumer blog and others, later became faculty advisors to that group. And Letty had been very influential and very helpful in my own professional career.
I came into Yale. Carol Christ was a year ahead of me, and we became good friends my second year and her third year at Yale. And we were each other's support system and were essentially each other's advisors. So I ended up writing a feminist dissertation, which was actually, I think, the second feminist dissertation in religious studies after Rita Gross's.
Wow.
Yeah. And Julian Hart was the advisor for both Carol and me. He already knew he was leaving for the University of Virginia when he agreed to become our advisor, but nobody else in the department would have taken on the dissertation. So I wrote it with not only no support, but with the director of graduate studies and other members of the department trying to torpedo it. I mean, Carol was really my advisor.
I was at a National Council of Churches Racial Ethnic Women in Ministry conference, and I had been on the planning team. And the keynote person for us was Katie Cannon. And Katie Cannon was this mythical figure for those of us in the Midwest. She was like, oh, and I ended up being her driver. And we now call it fangirl. I was in full fangirl. I couldn't even speak. And so she was sitting outside one of the cabins. And it was almost like Jesus and the little children. She was seated, and these women of different races and ethnicities were around her feet. And I was standing off to the side, just grinning, you know. And fine, she's talking to each person is talking about what they want to do. And she gets to me and she said, you know, you've been my driver, but you don't talk much. And she said, so what are your plans? I said, well, I know I want to teach, but I'm going to wait 5 years and then I'll go back to school. She gave me this look that I now call the Katie Cannon look. And I have described it, and everybody who has received this look says, yep, it's the Katie Cannon look. And it's one you don't want to get because she's looking at you like you have lost your last bit of sense. And so she gives me this look and she says, did you realize that as we sit here in 1984, there are only 5 Black women with earned PhDs in religion in the world? And she let that sink in because I know she could tell I was going through, and I knew who the 5 were, but I always assumed there would be more. I mean, it just didn't dawn on me that that was it. And so once she realized that it had hit home, she just said, do you really think we can afford for you to wait? So 2 weeks later, I was taking my GREs, and in that fall, I was back in the classroom.
Saw it that way. It's a sense that somehow Lisa Isherwood and me and Lely Wilson, we've suddenly moved into this category of elders. And of course, 3/4 of that group is dead. I'm not dead, neither is Lisa. But there's a sense that somehow we're being referred to as this past tense, you know, which is okay. But just so long as people think that they need to keep on, both asking the traditional question in a certain sense. In other words, the notion that women are inferior still has to be criticized. But to keep expanding in terms of the plurality of contexts and so forth. And I think doing this kind of cultural work they're doing is good.
Newer colleagues who are, I think, just doing marvelous research and writing and creative projects like this video that really will take the message of very differentiated understandings of feminism, womanism, mujerismo, and other ways of doing justice to much wider and broader audiences. So I'm extremely optimistic. My fears are but first of all, they're baseless, except for the examples that I give, but they're really converted into great enthusiasm and hope for what's going on in the field. I'm enormously hopeful.
I don't know what my hopes are, but my dreams would be for an open conversation in which feminists really talk to each other out of our experiences and understanding that all texts and traditions have to be interpreted by individuals and communities. There's no norm out there. The norm is within our communities.
You need to be passionate. You need to put your passions and your body onto that page. Monica Furlong, ages ago, said to me, you know, when you're in front of a computer, do you get turned on? I thought it was a very strange, and I understand now that it has to be about that fully embodied experience with what you're writing, that passion, that absolutely all the juices are flowing, the whole, you are there. And if you're not writing from that spot, and sometimes it's very difficult because it depends who you're writing for. And I remember as a young undergraduate, I used to say, I feel, and my professors used to say, you don't feel in theology, you think. And I never understood that distinction. And now, fortunately, I don't have to listen to that. I can feel. And that's what I would say to young scholars coming up. Feel. What's your body telling you? What is your body telling you about the issues that you're addressing? And start from there. And write with passion. Write with no fear. I think that's my advice. Anything that feels like a drag. And there will be times coming towards the end, you'll want to have a nervous breakdown, you'll hate everybody in the world. And, but that's just a passing phase. But to bring you there, you need that fire, you need that passion.
There has been progress over the years, but we're still not liberated. I mean, you know that stained glass ceiling is still there. It's been cracked, but it's still up there. So the struggle continues, and the work of Womanist, and the work of feminists, and the work of other women of color, Mujerista, women, Hispanic feminists, and Asian feminists. The work is still there, because liberation is still not a reality yet.
I find very much sad in the classroom when I hear students, especially graduate students, who say that reading the books of feminist theologians, they are so theoretical. I mean, not all. When I think about feminist theologians of liberation, they are sensitive. They bring the aspirations of people in the work for social justice to the academy. The academy is our site of the struggle. It is not my role to be out there with a weapon in hand, struggling for justice. I am on the streets in solidarity with the marches of NGOs and the women's movements when the time comes. But my day-to-day work is in the classroom. In the classroom, it is where this is the way in which I do. So I am creating a discourse which is not the one of mainstream discourse, but what tools do I have in theology? It is rhetoric, liberating emancipatory rhetoric. It is the power of words. It is the shaping ideologies, mindsets, changing culture, changing perceptions, worldviews. That is what we do. We do teaching. That's what we do. That is our side of the struggle. So for many students, I feel that they are out of place when they're asking for the academy what the academy cannot do. In terms of feminist theology, that is what we do. We are professors, teachers of theology. And the important thing is to keep one feet in the academy and the other rooted on the social movements for change. That is the key. Those who often say that the division exists between theory and practice are those who have no idea whatsoever, no rooting the movements for change out there.
Get out of that. Sorry, I'm just gonna sneeze. All right. So what we're gonna do now, there it was. Sorry, is to get into.
God bless you.
Thank you for some discussion. So I've got a couple questions just to kind of start prompt wise. I'm going to put them in the chat. So if you don't have the chat open, pull that up and I'll put that in the chat, and then that'll stay there for when you go into your breakout room. And I'll read them out too. So if anybody's on a phone or can't see the chat, you got a sense of what it is. All right. So, in what ways have you struggled expressing your own voice, especially in regards to your theological or religious thinking? Are there moments in church or in your faith community at Bellarmine that you feel like you've struggled expressing your belief or your particular voice in that context? Who in your life has helped you find your voice? Who and what, right? There may have been particular practices or moments that stand out for you as a way of really defining your voice in this conversation. And then what unique perspectives do you bring to theology? So thinking about yourself as a context, right? What layers do you bring? And background do you have as kind of like a particular insight or unique contribution to the conversation? So those are the three questions. And then I saw there was a couple questions in the chat. So for folks who didn't hear the definition between the kind of different branches of feminist theology, so there's feminist theologians who were kind of the initial predominantly white female theologians, people like Elizabeth Johnson or Elizabeth Schuster-Fiorenza or Rosemary Radford Ruther. And then womanist theologians were kind of the next big conversation. And womanist theology is specifically focused on gender and race, especially Black race. So Black women came to the conversation with feminists and Black theologians who were dealing with gender and race separately. And they really came to the academy. People like Jacqueline Grant, who was in the video, and Emily Towns, who was in the video, began to ask questions of how does my race and gender color each other? How do they shape each other? And how does that then reflect in the theology that I'm doing? And then there's also, you heard some terms like mujerista, which is dealing with race, class, and gender. So specifically coming out of Latin America. So mujerista theologians are doing theology from a Latin American liberation context. And then like folks like Kwok Prilon or Asian feminists sometimes use the term Minjong, which is like the people's theology in I think Chinese. So there's a lot of different branches, a lot of different terms, but the kind of overarching conversation, some folks use the overarching umbrella of feminism to talk about gender and all those different pieces. Some people use overarching term of liberation because all of these different conversations are focused on liberation from a particular oppression in different contexts. Let's see, what was the name of the woman in feminist theology who ended up no longer being Catholic? Oh, that was Mary Daly. Mary Daly wrote Beyond God the Father. She also wrote it's not ecofeminism. Let me pull it up real quick. Mary Daly. But she started in the Catholic Church. It's Gynecology is her other big text. So Beyond God the Father, and then Gyne Ecology is like separate two words to kind of be a word play. But she ended up breaking with the Catholic Church because of, especially around issues of female leadership. And so she was kind of one of the earlier women church movements that were separate from the Catholic Church. All right, and if you guys have questions, feel free to put those in the chat. But we've got these three on the table as far as reflecting on your own, expressing your voice, who has helped you express that and build that and structure it, and then what perspectives do you bring? So I'm going to put everybody into small groups. What do we think, Jane? There's 56 folks.
Okay. I would say not more than 6 people in a group, maybe even 5. Let's do 5.
Yeah. If we do 10, it's 5 to 6.
Okay. And what time are you thinking, Ashley? How much time?
What do you think? 15, 20 minutes?
15. Let's go 15. And then, no, Ruth, you want more? More time. So then that would leave us just 5 minutes left in the large group. Is that
Up to you.
Some people are saying no. Well,
let's do we won't do exactly one or the other. It'll be like 17 minutes.
Right, let's do that. Let's compromise. Yep.
When you get back from your group, if you have questions that came up in the group, just go ahead and put those in the chat, or raise your hand or something. We can start right there.
Good.
That sounds good.
That's a good plan. Thank you. Go ahead.
Open all the rooms.
So I could either go in my group or hang here with you. Oh, you're muted. Yeah.
Yeah, there we go. I said hanging here with me sounds good.
Yeah, the film, that's the second time I've seen it. And I'm so glad to watch it again because there is so much there.
Yeah.
That you have packed into that film. My goodness, what a legacy. What a capturing of those stories, those voices. And so are all those women still living now, or have we lost anybody since you
all
made
of them
that?
are still living. Rosemary Radford Ruther had a stroke about 2 years ago, so she's no longer speaking. She may have recovered some ability to speak, but the last kind of like within a year after that interview, we heard that she someone was like, thank goodness you spoke with her, because now she's kind of in recovery. And so yeah, all those women, I'm pretty sure everyone is still kicking. And we've got full interviews of all of them. So for I'm teaching a class, it's a 300 level class in the spring here. And when we read each of these women, they're going to watch the full interview that week too. So I'm excited to
play that whole thing. Good.
Yeah.
Oh, each one of them. And I'm particularly, I'm drawn to the South Korean woman. The way she speaks, she's as if she's smiling the whole time, and there's just a freshness about her spirit. But each one is just really remarkable.
Yeah, the interview with Kwok Pui-lan.
Kwok Pui-lan,
yeah, that one happened after I moved back to Cincinnati, so I wasn't able to go with Kate because she traveled to New York for that one. And I was, when I watched the interview later to help edit and stuff, and I was like, oh, that seemed like it was such a great conversation. Yeah, she's so like clear and like clearly like really enjoys doing the work. And yeah.
Right. Yeah.
The interviews that most of them I was able to be a part of. The Kwok Pui-lan and then Carol Kristen, Judith Plaskow also happened. Those were both done in New York that same year. But all the other ones I was able to actually be the interviewer, and that was just so fun because there's a lot of stuff that got cut out where we got to talk about things, and I was blessed.
Yes, sure. Gosh. So you do feel like you have a voice. Oh, you know what? I'm still recording this. Let me pause it.
Yeah. Hey, Jane.
Yes, Mary.
Is there any way you could try whether or not you can unmute Paula and Ed, because they couldn't get unmuted to talk with us?
Well, their problem was they were in two groups.
Yeah.
And so they heard.
Gosh.
And so we were hearing both. It was terrible.
Well, that was very crazy making, wasn't it? I'm sorry. I bet. Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah, I saw your name on twice. In fact, I see you on the screen twice here. So I'm not sure why that happened.
They've logged in twice. Somehow they've logged in twice.
Right, right. So I'm sorry
You
you had
guys
such a
have
difficult
a phone on,
experience.
yeah, phone on and a computer?
Maybe.
No?
No?
Wow.
No, it looks like two computers because they're both computers, one with a video and one without.
Mm-hmm.
Well, every time I asked my father a religion question and he didn't know the answer, which was 99% of the time, he always said, it's a mystery. So that's how we'll solve this problem.
Okay. Okay.
Well, one thing I told Ashley I was going to do this, so I'm going to do a shout out for Donna Park. So Donna, do you all know that Donna wrote this book?
Yes.
God is not a boy's name. God is much more than that.
Yeah.
Okay, there's her name at the bottom, Donna Park. You can get this on Amazon. Here's free advertising, Donna. Ashley has a 2.5-year-old daughter. She's very excited to see this book, and so we want to get one in her hands very soon. Thanks
Jane,
for writing this.
Jane, I'm sorry, could you put the title in the chat, please?
I will. Go ahead, Ashley. Let's see if anybody has a question or comment.
Yeah. Are there any questions or comments or reflections on your conversations?
I have the T-shirt, God is not a boy's name, and I wear that with my granddaughters.
That's great.
Ashley, we had a question come up in our group about what the Pope said today about and what that kind of means for I guess the church or
Yes, actually Jane was just informing me because I hadn't gotten the news until she was talking about it. Jane, did you want to kind of explain a little bit more?
If I understand correctly, he has officially named that women may be acolytes and Eucharistic ministers. Now, that seems like something that should have happened 100 years ago. However, the significance of that means it is opening the door for women to proceed into other ministries, including the diaconate. Okay, so it was an essential legalistic canonical step that had to be taken to open the door for this continued conversation. Okay.
I know dioceses. I lived in Maryland for 40 years. I know dioceses that did not allow women on the altar or women to do Eucharistic ministers. I mean, this is, 10 years ago, for God's sakes. And I know people that left those parishes because of that. So.
They mentioned that today, Florence, on the news, that because of that, those kind of very conservative bishops and archbishops are not going to be allowed to impose those kind of rules anymore.
Right. Because I know that it happened in the DC area. I don't want to name names because, I want to be able to go to sleep at night quietly. But
it's happened here, Florence. It's happened here.
Really?
So I became an altar boy when I was 50. Just because I was allowed to.
Our pastor used to call them altar creatures. Happy to let girls. The man was ahead of his time.
It's not there.
My daughter was in the first class of altar girls, and when she was probably in 8th grade, so she's 42 now, so 40 years ago, and we asked our pastor, why can Billy Helmkamp be an altar server and Kristen can't? And he said, well, there's no reason. And it was the beginning of having altar servers at our parish, and women ushers was a huge question because of the leaning issue. So we've come a long way.
Mary, I see your hand.
Yeah, I just kind of want to change the conversation. I'm glad about the Pope's choice, but I just want to thank you for these questions. I think they're really amazing questions for us to continue to sit with in terms of our own sense of the feminine divine, and just appreciate that, and appreciate the history lesson of all the women I've heard their names. It was neat to see many of them interviewed.
Yeah.
For that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, you're welcome. That's I just love watching it because I was lucky enough to be interviewing them, so actually talking with them. But you read these tomes like She Who Is or In Memory of Her, are these things that you've seen, and then you suddenly get this person behind it, and
Yeah.
it's great when you hear a lot of their lived experience. That
Is
is
that
behind it.
available elsewhere?
The film?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, it's on YouTube, but we're currently, so we have full length interviews. So they're usually right around an hour for each of the 11 women that we interviewed. So we are trying to figure out
The name of it?
It's online. If you go to Forging Voice Film, let me see.
You want to put that in the chat?
Yeah, I'll put it in the chat.
Okay.
Jane, you shared the earlier today. You shared the slides, and you can go right from the slide because I watched it earlier today.
Oh, good.
But I looked at the slides, and I just so you can get through it if you received the email from Jane.
Okay.
Here's another link to in the chat. We have a website. It's currently not live because so Kate and I are the ones that are kind of just funding this, and the website was costing us like $100 a year, and we weren't getting any funding for it. So we paused it while we were trying to find a free place to post the full length interviews and the film itself. So that's currently, you can find the film on her portfolio or on YouTube in the links in the PowerPoint. And if you are interested in any of the full length interviews, those are unlisted on YouTube, but I can send you the direct link just so that you can watch them. She's finishing up the editing on all of those so that they'll be more, right now they're a little rough cut, but they're still helpful. When the website is back up, I'll put that in the chat too.
We're very blessed to have had those women before us.
Oh, and it was so amazing to see their faces, having known their names. It was just wonderful.
Yeah, it's really, really a gift. By the way, we have recorded this entire session also, and it will go into our collection of recordings on our own Bellarmine Parish video recordings. So it's here too. Well, Ashley, thank you.
Yeah, and Ashley.
Ashley, could you answer the question? Who helped you find your voice?
Quite a few folks. I have been blessed to have a lot of female mentors all along the way. So in my undergrad, Mary Frost Pearson was actually an Islamic scholar who really sparked my interest in religion in a brand new way. And then in my master's program, Jillian Algren was such a great mentor to me and really pushed me. I'd not even thought really about PhD, and she really pushed me to start applying and thinking about that. And then in my PhD, my advisor, Shelley Rambo, was a great support. And the dean there at that school, Mary Elizabeth Moore, was someone who was kind of, not only a support for my voice I was the only female in my doctorate program. She was really aware of that and helpful, and also financially helped out a lot, gave me a scholarship and things. And then since I've been back at Xavier, it's been really, really wonderful to have colleagues that are women who've had children and are kind of ahead of me in the process to really help mentor me in that. So I would say my earliest kind of like critical thinker probably was kind of back in that undergrad level, because I actually went to undergrad to be a missionary. I had wanted to, just go, and I came from a kind of born again Christian Protestant background, and that was what I wanted to do. And then when I got to University of Dayton, I started taking Catholic theology classes, and they were like, just kind of blew my theology wide open. And so it was really wonderful to have that.
Ashley, where did you do your doctorate work?
Boston University. Yep. So I Luckily in Boston, one of the great things is all the universities up there, you can take classes across the universities. So I took most of my classes at BU, but then I also was able to take a class at Boston College and a class at Harvard with Nancy Pineda Madrid and Myra Rivera. I wasn't able, Elizabeth Schuster Fiorenza didn't teach anything while I was there, so I didn't get to take a class with her, but it was really nice to be able to get the whole range of different universities up there.
Cool. And how long ago did you interview these people for the, I'm curious.
Yeah, so most of the interviews were happening 2015. I think 2014 was our earliest, and then 2015, 2016. And I think the film was completed in 2018. And in fact, Jane asked when you guys were in the small group, she said, you know, are these women, are most of them still alive? And all of them are still alive and still, most of them are retired. Elizabeth Johnson just recently retired, but she's still writing. Rosemary Radford Ruther is the only one who's declined in health. She, about a year after that interview, had a stroke. And so she's been recovering and hasn't been able to really speak publicly since. So we were really thankful that we were able to get the interview when we did, because, you know, that generation is aging, and we don't want to lose the stories and the things that they didn't write. You know.
Rosemary Radford Ruther can't speak at all. She's at Pilgrim Place in Santa Clara, California. And I visited her about 2 years ago and was taken aback at how bad the stroke was with her. I have a great picture of her I should send to you.
Yeah. No, I did hear that I wasn't sure if she had recovered at all or not. That's very unfortunate.
Thank you all. And thank you, Ashley, again, for a really,
Yes,
really
thank
wonderful
you.
conversation.
Yes,
So
thank you.
2 weeks from tonight will be Jillian, your mentor. Jillian will be with us. So we'll see you again in a couple of weeks.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you,
Jane.
all.
Hi.
Jane, thank you.
Thank
Ashley.
you.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Enjoyable.
Happy to do
so
this.
much.
Wonderful.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye.
Night, night.
Jane,
Good night.
Yes.
Jane,
Yes.
could